Chapter 14. The Spirit of Antichrist. Unavoidable conflict. When we have realized the essential nature of any principle, we can form a pretty fair guess as to the general lines in which it will show itself in action, whether in individuals or institutions, nations or events. The evolution of principles is the key to all history in the past, and similarly is the key to all history that is yet to come. Therefore, if we grasp the significance of any principle, though we may not be able to prophesy particular events, we shall be able to form some general idea of the sort of development it prevalent may give rise to. Now, all through the Bible we find the statement of two leading principles which are diametrically opposed to one another. The principle of sonship or reliance upon God, and its opposite or the denial of God, and it is latter that is called the spirit of Antichrist. This spirit or mode of thought is described in the second chapter of the second epistles to the Thessalonians and the fourth chapter of the fourth epistle to Timothy, and its distinctive note is that it sets itself up in the temple of God, placing itself above all that is worshipped, and a similar description is given in Daniel 11:36-39. The winning side. The widespread development of this inverted principle, the Bible tells us, is the key to the history of the latter days. Those times in which we now live and the prophetic scriptures are largely occupied with a struggle which must take place between those opposing principles. It is impossible for the two to amalgamate, but they are in direct antagonism. And the Bible tells us that, though the struggle may be severe, the victory may at last remain with those who worship God. The reason for this becomes evident if we look at the fundamental nature of the principles themselves. One is the principle of the affirmative, and the other is the principle of the negative. One that which builds up, the other is that which pulls down. One consents to the initiative being taken by the Spirit, which has brought all creation into existence, and the other bids his Spirit take a back seat and denies that it has any power of initiative. This is the essence of the opposition between the two principles. Whatever one affirms, the other denies. And so, since no agreement is possible, the conflict between them must continue until one or the other gets the final victory. Now, if the spirit of Antichrist is what the Bible describes it, we cannot shut our eyes to the fact that it is now present among us. St. Paul tells us that it was already beginning to work in his day, only that at the time there was a hindrance to its fuller development. But he adds that when the hindrance should be removed, the development of the spirit of Antichrist would be phenomenal. Tradition. Various commentators on this text have explained the hindrance alluded to by St. Paul to have been the existence of the Roman Empire, and no doubt this is true as far as it goes. In this passage, 2 Thessalonians 2:1, St. Paul reminds the Thessalonians of something he had told them of the subject. That is, something he had communicated verbally and not in writing regarding the falling away which would take place before the resurrection. He says, "Remember ye not, when I was yet with you, I told you of these things, and now ye know what withholdeth, that he might be revealed in this time." The very earliest traditions tell us that when St. Paul had then verbally explained to the Thessalonians was that the Roman Empire, as then existing, must pass away before these future developments could take place. But he was careful not to put this in writing, lest it should express to Christians to additional persecution of the charge of being enemies to the state. This tradition is by no means a vague one. We first find it mentioned by Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp, who was himself the disciple of St. John, so that we get on the authority of one who had been instructed by a personal friend and acquaintance of the apostles, and we may therefore feel assured that in this tradition we have a correct statement of what St. Paul had said regarding the nature of the hindrance to which he alludes to in this epistle. The cause of the hindrance. The existence of the Roman Empire, then, was doubtless the outward and immediate cause of this hindrance to the coming of Antichrist. But we must remember that at the back of the external and visible circumstances, which are instrumental in the history of the world, there are mental and spiritual causes, and so the matter goes further and deeper than any existing political conditions. It is a question of spiritual principles, a question of causes, and so long as any given cause is at work, its effects will continue to show themselves, though the particular form they will assume will vary with the conditions under which the manifestation takes place. Therefore, we may look deeper than the political conditions of St. Paul's time to find the spiritual and causal nature of the hindrance to which he alludes. He tells us that at the time when he wrote, the spirit of Antichrist was already working, but that its complete manifestation was delayed till a later time by reason of a certain impediment, which would be removed in due time. And a comparison of this statement with that of St. Peter in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd epistle shows that the removal of this impediment and the full manifestation of the spirit of Antichrist were to be looked for in the time of the end. Now Daniel says the very same thing, Daniel 12, 1-4, and he points out the marks by which the time of the end is to be recognized. They are 2. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And if this is not an accurate description of things at the present time, well, I leave the reader to fill in the blank. We may say, then, that the time when the hindrance to the manifestation of Antichrist is to be removed is a time when the knowledge has been increased. And if we reflect the whole matter is one of spiritual power, it is not reasonable to suppose that the hindrance which in St. Paul's time prevented the full development of spiritual power of Antichrist was ignorance of the nature of spiritual power in general. Now this knowledge is becoming more and more widely diffused, and consequently the danger of its inverted application is today far greater than St. Paul's time. And therefore, the more we realize what potentialities open before us, the more it behooves us to be on the guard lest we regard them in such a way as to take the place of God in the temple of God. Mode of manifestation. It may or may not be that the man of sin, exhibiting himself as God in the temple of God, is to be understood as an actual ceremony taking place in an actual building, though even this is not altogether inconceivable if we recollect that during the French Revolution a notorious actress was enthroned upon the high altar in the Cathedral of Notre Dame as a goddess of reason, and received the public adoration of the official representatives of France. What has been may be again, and we know that history repeats itself. But I think we have to look for something more personal and powerful than any theatrical exhibition of this kind. If we search the Scriptures, we shall find that the real temple of God is man. When Christ said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rise it up again," he spake of the temple of his body. John 2, 19-21. And again St. Paul says, "Know ye not that you are the temple of God?" 1 Corinthians 3:16. Moreover, the promise is, "I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." 2 Corinthians 6:16. And so on in many similar passages, a careful consideration of which leaves no doubt but that the true significance of temple in Scripture is that of the human individuality. The meaning then becomes clear. The temple which is profane is the innermost sanctuary of the heart, out of which comes all the issues of our individual life. As he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. And if this be true, then it is of the utmost importance who is enthroned there. Is it the all-originating creative spirit with its infinite love, wisdom, and power? Or is it our personal knowledge and will? It must be one or the two. Which is it? The difference is immense, and it consists in this. If our personal knowledge, wisdom, and willpower are the highest things we know, then we are left exactly where we were and are making no advances. We may indeed accumulate a certain amount of knowledge of the hidden laws of physical and psychic forces not commonly known to our fellow man, which knowledge must necessarily carry a corresponding power along with it. But this only places us in a position where we more urgently need a higher knowledge and a higher wisdom to guide us. Power and purpose. The greater the power you put in anyone's hand, the more mischief will result if through ignorance of this true use he misapplies it. He may understand the mere mechanism, so to say, of this power perfectly, so that he will know how to make it work. It is not on the mechanical side that the mistake will occur, but the mistake will be in the purpose to which the power is applied. And if that be wrong, the greater the power, the worse will be the results. You may teach a child to drive a motor car, but unless you can at the same time invest him with powers of observation, caution, and promptness in emergency beyond his years, his driving will end in a smash. Harmonious development. Now it is just the inspiration beyond our natural acuteness, of foresight beyond our unaided vision, that we require for the really useful employment of any enhanced powers that may come to us as a result of our increasing knowledge. And this is not to be drawn from the knowledge of what we may call the merely mechanical working of the law of cause and effect, whether on the side of the visible or the invisible. That knowledge, taken by itself, is only the lower knowledge, learning, so to say, how to do that particular trick. But to make it of real value, we need to know not only how to do it, but why to do it. And since the only true why is the building up of any harmonious whole, both in ourselves and in the race, a whole which, by an organic connection between the cause sown today and the results produced tomorrow, shall continually germinate into greater and greater fullness of joyous life. And since the production of such a continuously growing and rejoicing wholeness is the only reasonable purpose to which our knowledge and our powers, whether great or small, can be applied, how are we to get such an outlook into the unending future and into our present relation, in all their ultimate consequences, by our own personal knowledge, however extended? We are sowing causes all the time with only a very limited outlook as to what they will produce. But if we are conscious that we have submitted our actions to the guidance of the supreme wisdom and love, we know that we must be importing into it an adjustment with the great purpose of the universe. We cannot grasp that purpose in all its detail and infinite extent, but we can see that it must be an unending growth into ever-increasing manifestation of the life, love, and beauty, with the all-originating Spirit is in itself. That Spirit is in itself unity, and its self-expression is through its manifestation in multiplicity. And the more clearly we see this, the more clearly we shall see that the way to cooperate with it is by seeking to make our own thought the channel of its thought. But to do this is to recognize the presence of divine intelligence guiding our thought and a divine power working through our actions. And this recognition, coupled with the desire that our thought should be thus guided and our action thus vivified, is the very essence of worship. It is the very opposite to the mental attitude which sets itself up as needing no guidance and no help from a higher source, and which denies the working of any higher power, and so worship becomes the foundation principle of the life. This does not mean a specific ceremonial observance, but the adoption of the principle of worship, which is the recognition of the true relation of the individual mind to the parent mind from which it springs. Modes of worship. If anyone finds that a particular ceremonial conduces towards this end, then that ceremonial is useful to him. But it does not follow that the same ceremonial is necessary for anyone else. It is just like watercolor painting. One man requires to keep his paper dry through the progress of the work, while another paints entirely in the wet. Yet if they are both artists, each will record his vision in a way that will unfold to the spectator some secret of nature's beauty. Each must use the means which at his present stage he finds most conducive to the end. Only let him remember that it is the end alone which really counts. Therefore it is the great teacher laid down only one rule for worship, that it should be in spirit and in truth. The essence and not the form is what counts, because the whole thing is a question of mental attitude. It is that attitude of constant receptiveness which is the only possible conscious correlative to the infinite divine givingness. To attain this is conscious union with the all-created Spirit. Logic. The logic of it may be briefly put thus. We want to come into touch with the power which originates the universe, but we cannot do this and at the same time disqualify it by denying that it all continues to be originative when it comes in touch with ourselves. Therefore, to be really in touch with it as the originating power, we must let it lead us and not try to compel it, and to do this is to worship. The mark of the opposite mental attitude is to take no heed of such a guiding power, and then the only alternative is to set oneself in its place. When we realize that spiritual causes are always at the back of external phenomena, and the more we come to see the particular causes can be resolved into variations of the ultimate cause, the more our intent to rule that ultimate cause must result in self-deification. But the bad logic comes in not seeing that the real ultimate cause must be entirely originative. That is just what makes it worth seeking and trying to deprive it of its power by attempting to compel it instead of looking to it for leading. Psychic force. It is just here that those who realize the nature of spiritual causation are in greater danger than the mere materialist. There really is an unseen force which can be controlled in a manner they contemplate, and their mistake is in supporting that this force is the ultimate creative power. I dare say some readers will smile at this, and I am well aware that it is quite possible to build up an apparently logical argument to show that what I am now speaking of is a merely fanciful idea, but to these I will not make any reply. The matter is one requiring careful development, and a partial and inadequate explanation would be worse than useless. I must therefore leave its discussion to some other occasion, and in the meanwhile ask my readers to assume the existence of this force simply as a working hypothesis. In asking this, I am not asking more than they are ready to concede in the case of physical science, where it is necessary to assume the existence of purely speculative conditions of energy and matter, if we would coordinate the observed phenomena of nature into an intelligible whole. And in like manner, I would ask the critical reader to assume as a working hypothesis the existence of an essence intermediate between the originating spirit and the world of external manifestation. The existence of such an intermediary is a conclusion which has been arrived at by some of the deepest thinkers who have ever lived, and it has been called by various names in different countries and ages. But for the purpose of the present book, I think I cannot do better than adopt the name given it by the European writers of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. They called it anima mundi, or the soul of the world, as distinguished from animus Dei, or the divine spirit, and they were careful to discriminate between the two. If you look in a Latin dictionary, you will find that this word, which means life, mind, or soul, is given in a twofold form, masculine and feminine, animus and anima. Now it is in a dual nature thus indicated that the action of spiritual causation consists, and we cannot eliminate either of the two factors without involving a confusion of ideas which the recognition of their interaction would prevent us falling into. When once we recognize the nature and function of anima mundi, we shall find that under a variety of symbols it is referred to throughout the Bible, and indeed forms one of the principal subjects of its teaching. But to explain these Bible references would require a book of itself. In general, however, we may say that anima mundi is the eternal feminine, and the necessary correlative to the animus Dei, the true originating spirit. It is what the medieval writers called the universal medium, and it is that principle which I pointed out in the opening chapter of this book is esoterically called water. It is not the originating principle itself, but it is that principle through which the originating principle operates. It is not originative, but receptive, not the seed, but the ground, formative of that which is impregnated, as is indicated by the old French expression for ventre saint gris, or the holy blue womb. The innermost maturing piece of nature, and its power is that of attracting the conditions necessary for the full maturing of that seed, with which it is impregnated, and thus bringing about the growth which ultimately culminates in completed manifestation. Subconscious mind. Perhaps the idea may be put into terms of modern Western thoughts by calling it the subconscious mind of the universe, and if we regard it in this light, we may apply to it all the laws of the interaction between conscious and subconscious mentality, with which I conclude most of my readers are familiar with, and are explained more fully in the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. Now, the chief characteristic of subconscious mind are its amenability to suggestion, and its power of working on into mental conditions the logical consequence of the suggestion impressed upon it. It is not originative, but formative. It does not provide the seed, but it causes it to grow, and the seed is a suggestion impressed upon it by the objective mind. If then we credit the universal subjective mind with these same qualities, we find ourselves face to face with a stupendous power, which by its nature affords a matrix for the germination of all seeds of thought that are planted in it. Looking at the totality of nature as we see it, the various types of life, vegetable, animal, and human, and the evolution of these types from earlier ones, we can only come to the conclusion that the originating mind, animus Dei, as distinguished from anima mundi, must in the first instant see things generically. The type, rather than the individual, much as Plato puts it in his doctrine of archetypal ideas. And so the world as we know it is governed by a law of averages, which maintains and advances the race, whatever may become of the individual. We may call this a generic or type creation, as distinguished from the conception of a specific creation of particular individuals. But as I have explained more fully in the creative process in an individual, the culminating point of such a generic creation must be the production of individual minds which are capable of realizing the general principle at work, and therefore of giving it individual application. Now it is the imperfect apprehension of this principle that causes its inversion. It is recognizing anima mundi without animus Dei. And the more a man sees of the immense possibility of his own thought and volition working upon anima mundi, while at the same time ignoring animus Dei, the more likely he is to grow too big for his boots. He then logically has nothing to guide him but his own personal will, and with all the resources of anima mundi at his disposal, there is no saying to what extremes he may not go. Appetite comes from eating, and the more power he gets, the more he will want, and the more his desires are gratified, the more he will become satiated and require fresh stimulus to his jaded appetites. Knowledge. This is no fancy picture. History tells us of Emperor Tiberius offering a great reward to anyone who would discover a new pleasure, and Nero burning Rome for a sensation. Picture such men in the possession of a knowledge of psychic laws, which would place all the powers of anima mundi at their disposal. And then imagine not one such, but hundreds of thousands combining in some common enterprise under the leadership of some preeminently gifted individual, and recollect in his connection the accumulated power of massed mental action, and what must be the result? Surely just what the Bible tells us, the working of all sorts of prodigies, which to the uninstructed multitude must appear to be nothing else than a miracle. The knowledge, then, of the enormous possibilities stored up in anima mundi, or the soul of nature, is the great instrument through which the power of the Antichrist will work. It is indeed the acquisition of this power that will more and more confirm him in his idea of self-deification. And note that though for convenience I use a singular pronoun, I am speaking of a class, that is, of all who do not offer to God the sincere worship of trust and divine love, wisdom, and power. I use the name Antichrist as that of a class, and not one which seems likely to be widespread before long, though this in no way excludes the possibility of some phenomenally powerful leader of this class attaining to a preeminence, which will make him the typical manifestation of the principle of self-deification. Antichrist, whether as class or as an individual, has attained to the recognition of a great universal principle, which I have endeavored to set forth in this and other books. The principle of the introduction of the personal factor into the realm of unseen causes. He has laid hold of a great truth. Hubris. All progress beyond the merely generic working of the law of averages is to be made by the introduction of the personal factor. But the mistake which Antichrist makes is that he cannot see any personality but his own. He sees the soul of nature and the power of its responsiveness to the personal elements in the mind of man, and he sees no further. Therefore, after his own fashion, he recognizes the spiritual power of mere forces, but he does not recognize beyond this the presence of the God of gods. Logically, therefore, he becomes to himself the person. He rightfully says that the law of cause and effect is universal, and that the expansion of this law to the production of hitherto unknown effects depends upon the introduction of the personal factor. But he does not understand the reinforcement of the individual human personality by a divine personality, the recognition of which would bring into that principle of worship, which from the standpoint of this imperfect assumption of premises, he logically denies. To this power based upon self-deification is opposed the power based upon the worship of God, and the fact to be noted is that they are both using the same instrument. Both work by the power of the personal factor acting upon the impersonal soul of nature. The anima mundi itself is simply neutral. It is responsive to impression and generative of the conditions corresponding to the seed sown in it. But being entirely impersonal, is without any sort of moral consciousness and will therefore respond equally to the impression of good or evil. Therefore, in estimating the final result, anima mundi, may be entirely eliminated from our calculation. To put it mathematically, if anima mundi be represented by the same quantity of either side of the equation, it may be struck out from both sides, and then the real calculation will involve only the remaining factors. In the case we are considering, the only other factor is that of personality, and consequently the ultimate question at issue is, on which side is the greater fourth of personality? The infinite is greater than the limited. The answer to this question is to be found in the cosmic creation. We are part of that creation. Our personality is part of it. Our personality proceeds by derivation from the all-originating spirit, and therefore, logically, that spirit must be the infinite personality. It is true we cannot analyze or fathom the profundities of the spirit, and from this point of view we may speak of it as the unknowable, and so we may not be able to define what the all-creating spirit consciousness of personality may be to itself. But unless we entirely deny our derivation from it, must it not be clear that it must contain the infinite potential of all that can ever constitute personality in ourselves? And if this be so, then the growth of our own personality must be proportioned to the extent to which its potential flows into us, and to adopt the receptive mental attitude towards our Creator, which will allow of such an inflowing is to take the attitude of worship which Antichrist denies. Therefore, the greater power of personality is on the side of the worshippers of God. Then if this be so, their control over the powers of the unseen is greater than that of the Antichrist. But they do not seek to control these powers in the same way that he does. He knows no personality but his own, and so he seeks to gain his control by his own knowledge of particular laws and by his own force of will, and is thus limited by the capacities of his own personality. However extensive they may be, his method is to consciously control anima mundi for his own purpose by his own strength. Those on the opposite side do not thus seek to subject anima mundi to their personal will. Many, perhaps a majority of them, do not even know that there is such a thing as anima mundi, and so they rely on a simple trust in the Father. And those among them who do know it know also that the worshipper of God may entirely eliminate it from consideration, as I have already said, and so they also rely upon simple trust in the Father. The only difference is that, knowing something of the nature of the medium through which the unseen powers are working on both sides, and that the ultimate question is only that of personality, they should have a yet stronger faith than their less instructed brethren, though in kind it is still the same faith, that of the Son and the Father. Whether, then, instructed in these matters or not, the worshipper of God will, by their very faith and worship, be exercising a constant influence over anima mundi, attracting all those conditions which must tend to their final victory over the opposing force. Their worship enshrines the all-creating Spirit in their hearts, and their thoughts of Him and desires toward Him go forth into the soul of nature, impregnate it with the seed of the good, the beautiful, and the life-giving, which must assuredly bring forth fruit into its likeness of its own kind in due time. Their method may not produce the sensational effects which may, perhaps, be produced by their opponents when the development of psychic forces reaches its climax, but in the end all such temporary wonders will be swept away by the overflowing of power, which must result when anima mundi becomes permeated by animus Dei, not merely as now in the generic sense of the maintenance of the world, but also in the specific sense of the introduction of the personal factor in its complete divine manifestation. Prophecies. Thus it will be seen that in its grand delineation of the closing scene of the present age, the Bible nowhere departs from the universal law of cause and effect. There is a reason for everything if we can only penetrate deep enough to find it, and the laws of causation with which we are gradually gaining a better acquaintance in the realm of our own mentality are the same laws which in the wider scope embrace nations and make history. When we see this, the why and wherefore of even the great climax of the present age which the Bible sets forth before us becomes intelligible. We may not be able to predict specific events, but we can recognize the development of principles, and so we see more clearly the meaning of those inspired prophecies which would otherwise be enigmatic to us. then when we see that these prophecies are in no way isolated from the natural laws of the universe, but rather are based upon them, and are in fact the description of those very laws operating in their widest field of action on the human plane, we shall feel the more confidence in these hints of definite measures of time which they afford us. This is a very important part of their message, and though we may not be able to reckon the precise day or year, we may yet come to a very close approximation of our present whereabouts in the chronological calendar, and there are many indications to show that we are very rapidly approaching that climax which the Bible calls the end of the age. This, however, is far too large a question for me to open up in these concluding pages, and perhaps it may be my privilege to treat it at some other future time. But I have endeavored here to offer some suggestions of the general lines on which the Bible student may intelligently approach the subject. Realizing the close connection that exists between the Bible teachings regarding the forgiveness of sins, the spirituality of worship, the development of personality, and the originative action of the all-creating Spirit, these are all parts of one great whole and cannot be disassociated. To disassociate them is to pull down the edifice of the divine temple. To realize their unity is to build up that true temple of God, which is the individuality of man made perfect by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. It shall come to pass that whosoever shall call in the name of the Lord shall be saved. Acts 2:21. Him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. John 6:37. Maranatha. End of chapter, end of book. This audio presentation of Bible Meaning and Mystery by Thomas Troward has been brought to you by AudioEnlightenment.com and has been recorded for the exclusive use of Audio Enlightenment members only. If you have received this audio from any website other than our own, please visit our website. Let us know at your convenience.